Welcome, everyone, to the Ecopsychology Café. Hello, my name is Carol Koziel, and I'm the founder of the Canadian Ecopsychology Network, the host of this series. Monica Dragos and I co-created this program. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live in the traditional territory of the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people under the treaties of peace and friendship. I offer gratitude to the Indigenous people who live here now and who have lived here for thousands of years, for the legacy of caring for the land, water, fire, and air. I acknowledge the many creatures and living beings whose habitat was here and is here today. I acknowledge the ongoing impacts of colonization and systemic oppression of the people and the land on which we reside. Today, as we discuss the importance of community, I invite all of us to uncolonize our work to embrace wider systems of care and concern. I am so grateful to be in conversation with LaUra Schmidt, the founder of the Good Grief Network and the brains behind the 10 Steps to Resilience and Empowerment in a Chaotic Climate program and the Flow Facilitation Training. LaUra hails from Michigan and graduated with a bachelor's in environmental studies, biology, and religious studies. That's an interesting combination, LaUra. And her master's is in environmental humanities. LaUra is a Climate Reality Leadership Corps member and mentor. She recently earned certificates in integrative somatic trauma therapy and climate psychology. And congratulations, LaUra, on your new book, How to Live in a Chaotic Climate. Finally, it is out in paper. And we'll talk about that too today. Anything you'd like to add or start before we launch into our conversation?
Just tremendous gratitude for being here. Actually, 4 years ago, we had a similar interview. Amy was able to join us for that one, but it was just about 4 years ago to the date.
Wow.
Give a week or two.
Wow, that's great.
Yeah.
So do you want to start just kind of with the 10 steps for anybody that doesn't know about them, LaUra? Okay, I'm going to share my screen and just pull up the slide, and maybe you can walk us through them.
Definitely. While Carol is doing that, the 10 steps originated because of all of these degrees that Carol announced at the beginning that I went through. It's looking right at the problem, and I realized as somebody who has a lot of trauma, I needed to figure out resilient strategies to sustain myself if I wanted to be a change maker. And so it started as kind of a self-inquiry of like, what are the things I need to do so I can continue to show up in my life, and mapped out a number of steps. We started with 9 when my wife, Amy Lewis Rowe, and I started running the program, but the creation really stems from my graduate work in the environmental humanities program at the University of Utah. And I interviewed authors and researchers and change makers and asked them how they sustain themselves, and then went into the available climate psychology research and sociological research at the time and just mapped out some best practices that are now steps. And the steps are as follows. The first one is accept the severity of the predicament. What's really nice about when we meet collectively, and we can talk about this later, is that we don't have to agree on what we think the severity of the predicament is. We just have to agree that it is bad, it's impacting our lives, and we need to sort of figure out new directions, new pathways forward. And so there's a lot of openness in accepting the severity of the predicament. Step 2 is be with uncertainty. 3 is honor my mortality and the mortality of all. 4 is do inner work. This is the feelings work. This is the trauma healing step. 5 is develop awareness of biases and perception. And Amy likes to call this one the permission to be wrong step. We all have permission to be wrong because our biases and our perception kind of mask us from reality. The 6th step is practice gratitude, seek beauty, and create connections. Step 7 is take breaks and rest. Every change maker needs that. Every human being needs that. 8 is grieve the harm I have caused. It acknowledges the complicity of the harm that we're doing as human beings, but also those of us who live in the dominant culture. Step 9 is about showing up for ourselves and for our communities. And 10 is a reinvestment in meaningful efforts, meaning now that we've gone through this program, now that we've done a lot of inner work, how do we show up in the outer world in ways that enhance connection and healing and community? And we can use a lot of the space and a lot of the energy that has previously been occupied by fear and despair and grief, and a lot of the things that we tend not to want to look at. Once we look at them, once we figure out how to process them, how do we then reinvest that energy into the meaningful actions or the meaningful efforts that are asking to be birthed by each of us?
Super. I'm going to stop the share now, if that's okay, Laura.
Yeah, thanks for putting that up.
You're welcome. So now that we've got that kind of in front of us, I noticed that you use the word predicament instead of problem. And you also reference in the book, Francis Weller, the long dark. Why did you choose these kind of terms to frame this work?
Yeah, so a problem has a solution. A problem is navigable. A problem is kind of digestible, whereas a predicament is a series of problems. It's very vast in its complexity, and it doesn't just have one solution. And so whereas a problem we can start engaging and figure out the pathway forward, a predicament instead has to be lived with and coped with and moved with. Like it becomes part of us to kind of honor and move through, instead of just being like, I know the solution to that problem, it's ending plastic use. It just is the magnitude of complexity, the breadth and the depth of the issues we're facing, because it's not just climate change, it's our social issues, it's our democratic issues or democracy issues, it's the way money has been historically moved and used. And so all these things are actually just limbs of a very, very big tree, and we actually should focus on the root of the dysfunction, the root of how we got here. And I think it's disconnection, and we can talk a little bit more about this upcoming soon, but I think reconnection is healing, but we have to be able to engage on every level, including with ourselves and our inner worlds, with each other in the more than human world. And we use Francis Weller's term, the long dark, because Francis Weller is a therapist, he's a writer, he calls himself a soul activist, and he has just done profound grief work, and he's teaching many of us how to do grief work. And the idea with the long dark is that so often we prioritize the light, and we prioritize all of the things that feel good and all of the feelings that we want to feel. And we sacrifice things like the dark and the unpleasant feelings. And the long dark is an invitation into this vast amount of spaciousness where a lot of rearrangement can happen, where culture building can happen, where composting happens. And if we can't look at even like the life cycle holistically, then we're doing ourselves as human animals a disservice. We're doing the culture a disservice. And Francis Weller does not use the long dark in a negative term. He does not use it negatively. He invites us into the generativeness that comes in a time of collapse, in a time of endings, in a time of sheddings. Like, what new things can be birthed when we let go of the things that aren't serving us. And so endings provide opportunities for new creations, but so often we're so scared of the endings, and it tends to bring up fear and grief. But if we know how to navigate the fear and the grief and those overwhelming feelings, then we can hold on to see that endings are beginnings as well. And because we're bringing up Francis Weller, I'll just bring up a few questions, because he's asked us that through the long dark, how can we become skillful in navigating our walk in the dark? He asks, how do we cultivate imagination? How do we cultivate collaboration? How do we cultivate fields of reciprocity with Earth, within human and the more than human communities, in a way that we're not extracting more than what can be replenished? And how do we cultivate the spiritual values of restraint and mutuality? I think all of those are questions that are going to lead us through this time period of the long dark, of this rearrangement.
Thanks for that, Laura. But going back to your framing of the predicament, how did you determine that the first step, accept the severity of the predicament, is the place to start?
Yeah. It's one of the hardest steps. It's a really hard place to start from. And I looked at other models of healing and collective healing. Joanna Macy does not start with accept the severity of the predicament. I believe she and the work that Reconnect starts from coming from gratitude as the base. So you have a base to work from. And then you look at the typical 12-step modalities, and there's a level of acceptance right at step one. And I think that I was drawn a little bit more to getting folks on the same page in that we have to acknowledge and have some amount of acceptance that things, particularly in the dominant culture, have gone terribly wrong. And it's impacting us on the global level, on the community level, nation state level, but also in our own individual body, mind, somas. And if we can't start from a place of accepting that something is terribly wrong, again, we don't have to agree on the magnitude of how wrong things are or how right things are, but we do have to acknowledge that, like, we're not going to look away from this anymore. We're going to look at it and we're going to stay with it so that we can build capacities to be with it and to work through. And so not just the first step, which is accept the severity of the predicament, but learning how to be with uncertainty and honoring our mortality are perhaps the hardest steps for us, and we have them back to back. And we try to tell our participants, like, stay with it, it gets lighter, we're going to learn some other things. But I think until we can have a sustained gaze at the predicament, we can't really move through it. We can't move through something we refuse to look at.
I'm thinking about Donna Haraway's Staying with Trouble, right?
Yes.
Which is a wonderful little book. So you touched on the need to acknowledge our death anxiety and how we really can't skip that step. Can you speak about why the whole death anxiety thing comes up so early in the process?
Amy, my wife, Amy Lewis Rowan, co-founder of Good Grief Network, we actually did skip it to begin with. The program was a 9-step program in its first iteration. And when we were doing kind of our download or debrief session with our participants afterwards, we realized that death and mortality were the elephant in the room that often went unacknowledged. And Amy and I have been studying a lot of death anxiety, particularly through Ernest Becker and terror management theory. It was one of the courses we had to take as undergrads called Death and Dying, and we really looked at death anxiety. And I think once you see through the lens of death anxiety, which basically just means that we're mortal creatures, but we're also self-reflexive. So that means, from a very young age, we have this epiphany of, like, oh, my life is finite, I'm going to die. And it is so psychologically taxing. It's so much for us to deal with that oftentimes we repress it or we move away from it and we just refuse to look at it. And then it manifests in a lot of harmful ways. But there are ways to productively use our death anxiety as well. It just is, and the knowledge of our death becomes an invitation at how we're going to live. And we wanted to bring that front and center into the program because, like the long dark or like darkness, death is an integral part of life. It's not separate from life. It's just a different part of life. Every living being will die and decay and compost into something else, and our nutrients get used for something else. And until we can really face that we're mortal beings and we have a finite amount of time, I think we're going to keep pushing it away. And terror management theory teaches us that if we choose not to bring our death into our conscious awareness, it can actually manifest in really harmful ways towards those that we perceive to be in an out group. And I think this explains a lot of the behavior that we're seeing with the overwhelming racism, with the othering of just people of color in general, and those who are perceived to be different from us. We are more okay with witnessing their harm or even engaging in their harm. And I think culturally we see this in mass in lots of different, we're seeing it right now in the Middle East. We've seen it for the last several decades in the Middle East. It's like, who are we othering is a manifestation of death anxiety. And maybe that's too simplistic, because I also think othering is a really natural way of surviving. It's just that we hold so tightly to our ideas of who's in our in-group and who's in our out-group that we forget that those distinctions are supposed to be porous and they're supposed to be challenged, and that now is a time for inclusivity and a time for challenging who we have perceived to be other. Anyway, the point is that this death anxiety, this manifestation of our fears of our own death, can really come out in some harmful ways unless we productively use it. And so our step 3, our death anxiety step, is an invitation to honor that death is a natural and normal part of our lives, and that we can actually be really mindful of the fact that we're mortal beings. And with that, it invites us into more presence, and it invites us into more being in the moment instead of fearing for our future, because regardless of whether or not we're in a predicament, we're not guaranteed tomorrow anyway. You know, I might step out into traffic and have an accident and die. I might have a heart attack. Like, being a mortal being allows me to be here with everything I have. And we need to acknowledge that there are severe justice issues with regard to death, both with marginalized communities, but also with the earth. We're entering into another mass extinction. And so we're seeing unnatural rates of death all around us. And I think it's complicated, and an invitation of these times to live with the paradox of death is natural and normal, and we're seeing unnatural and not normal amounts of death that are unjust and unfairly, looking for a word here, but like perpetrated on those things that we think are different from us.
So I'm curious, what happens in your program when someone goes, yeah, and they just kind of give this step lip service without doing the deep dive? What happens for the rest of the program?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the steps, even though they're presented linearly, perhaps are not linear. And just like any other step program, it's process work, which means that actually a lot of the work happens when you're away from the group, when you're on your own. And if somebody's not ready to face their mortality, if somebody's not ready to help their death anxiety become conscious, then perhaps we've planted a seed that maybe they can explore later at a different time when they're a little bit more open. And we try to provide resources as well, so people can see other voices or hear other voices and see other theorists talk about death anxiety and its manifestations. So hopefully we've given them like a little nudge in that direction if they're not quite ready to deal with it. And I think they'll find that if they've not actually touched it by step 10, they may need to go through the process again. And for some of us, it's an ongoing process. Like I'm like, oh, we're back at step 1 again. You know, like I've learned something new about the dysfunction of the way that we're being in the world. I'm back at step 1. Or I'm holding too tightly to something. I'm back at step 2, like learning how to be with uncertainty, which is one of the only fundamental truths of this life.
So it's an iterative process.
Yes.
Okay. So why do we need collective healing spaces, and what are the essential characteristics to help us process this work?
Bell Hooks said, "Rarely, if ever, are any of us healed in isolation. Healing is an act of communion." And we've been made to believe that our healing should be privatized and that we should be able to handle everything on our own. And we know from nervous system science, from psychology, that that's simply untrue. We're deeply wired for connection. We're deeply wired to be seen and have intimacy with other people and the more than human world. And so if we can have collective healing spaces, a space to breathe, a space to name our pain, a space to practice, then we can move a little bit closer to trust. And I think that the dominant culture really erodes trust. It erodes the trust in ourselves to be actors and agents of our own lives. It erodes the trust that we have in each other because we're taught to be competitive, we're taught to isolate, we're taught to privatize our pain, as I named a moment ago, but we're also taught that we're always in competition about something. Like money is scarce, jobs are scarce, everything's scarce. And competition in a healthy way is good, but competition as part of your culture leaves you feeling lacking, leaves you feeling untrustworthy. So the collective healing spaces help us practice trust. They help us practice authenticity, which leads to vulnerability. And vulnerability, as Brene Brown teaches, is the birthplace of creativity and connection. And if we're unwilling to be vulnerable together, then how can we possibly attend to a predicament? If we're unwilling to be vulnerable together, how can we possibly trust each other, not only for co-regulation, not only for our nervous systems talking to each other and kind of saying, we're going to be okay, we're going to get through this, but when the wildfire rips through our community and we need to work together to heal and to move forward. Collective healing spaces like the 10-step program or Good Grief Network end up just being practice grounds for us to play out the larger trust building and the larger community making that is absolutely essential in these times.
So what would be some of the essential characteristics of a healing space, a collective healing space?
Yeah. Well, one of the main things would be, one of the things we do is create a sort of rules or community agreements, because we have to know what we're here for and what we're going to be doing. And we also have to know what happens when those community agreements are breached, which means that we have to also have a plan for repair and accountability, or rather accountability and repair. In our spaces, we create a lot of space where you can come with anything that's on your heart or your mind. And so the steps become prompts. You know, we're going to work step 2 today. But really, if you've had a horrible day at work and you're just really distraught, that your time for sharing can be for anything that you need to express. And the other thing that we found about this collective healing space is that we don't offer advice. It's not a discussion, it's a sharing space. And so when I feel free to come as myself, when I feel free to say whatever is on my heart, mind, and 13 people bear witness to it and say, I hear you, LaUra. Like for some participants, they've expressed that that's the first time they've ever truly been heard in their lives, that they've had the freedom to just express whatever is on their heart, mind. And I think that's a really beautiful freedom that we're not allotted in our culture. Many of us don't have friends or family members or colleagues where we can actually talk about the feelings part of it. And every day every day is a heartbreaking time in this culture, in this time and place. You know, like we're seeing ongoing wars, we're seeing a lot of racism, we're seeing people shot for pulling in the wrong driveway. It just is. Collective healing spaces allow us a place to name these things and to have other people hear them, so that we're not just holding them and we're not repressing them and we're not pushing them down.
And so how might ecopsychology support the role of radical reconnection, which is part of the collective healing space?
We often forget that we are the earth and we are a part of the earth. We've tried to really set ourselves apart from it, and yet the things we eat are earth, and then they become our body. The air we breathe is earth, and it becomes part of our body. And I think ecopsychology has a lot to offer us in understanding that we are part of the ecology and not separate of it. And once we can realize that we're part of a system and not sort of inventing a system, I think it offers this humility. It offers that reconnection that we're so longing for. It reminds us to slow down. Like the pace of the dominant culture is not sustainable for our nervous systems. Like we burn out because the dominant culture also teaches us that productivity is the goal, whereas Earth's goal is survival and diversity and beauty and just like I'm imagining this like flourishing. Like how many ways can we be different, I think, is the Earth's main question. But once we situate ourselves as part of that, I think think that's where the radical reconnection happens. Like we realize we're a small part of a very big story that's unfolding, and we get to be a part of it.
Yep, yep. And just curious, have you run any groups out in a natural setting?
When we first started, we wanted ritual to be a bigger component than it is right now, and we were meeting in person. And so our first several, we started in 2016 in the late summer. And so our first several sessions were outside, and it was absolutely beautiful and amazing. And I would love to get back to that, but we're having a bit of trouble getting back to in-person meetings after COVID, just because of the structure of things. And so most of our meetings are digital. But we have a heavy component of kind of like Monica led us through at the beginning, but like, where are your resources and how can you start to see Earth as one of your resources? Maybe it's a river, maybe it's a tree, maybe it's noticing something different in your garden every day. Gardening season here in the northern part of the world is coming to an end until the next season, but like, what kinds of growth in the natural world can you see and can you touch? And I don't think it's a coincidence that we heal faster when we have access to a window in our hospital room, or our nervous system slow down if we're able to go outside. We start to just regulate and heal in the presence of Earth. And so how do we further cultivate that into our everyday lives? Our
Right.
digital spaces try to represent that and try to invite that in, but it's a little hard when we're in a computer, unless you have a background that's of an ocean scene. That's very helpful as well.
That's the way I use it. Works for me. So thinking about different techniques in your book, I was thrilled to see that Amy has come up with a music playlist to accompany the book. How did the whole music thing come into this process?
Amy loves music. She has as long as I have known her. She actually DJs under the name Existential, which is a fun name. And like, even when we were friends many, many years ago in our early 20s, we would burn CDs for each other. And so music has always been a healing component for us as individuals. And then as Good Grief Network has evolved, Amy's been making playlists and sharing them with the network. Whenever we have a training session, we end every training session with a dance. We invite people into intuitive body movement. We don't call it dance because that tends to shut people down. But we love music, and Amy especially loves music, and she has always prided herself on the diversity of music, on the range of music. It doesn't matter if it came out 60 years ago or if it came out last week. She's going to put it on a playlist and make it work. And so the flow of music is very important to her. And we were approached by our publisher because we'd been talking a lot about music. And in the book, Amy talks about how she has dance parties and how that is her workout, and how she regulates her emotions better after she's been dancing. And so the publisher asked us if we were interested in kind of making a playlist for people to listen to as they're reading. And so Amy did it, and is super grateful for this question. And she wants me to tell you that in this playlist, and we can share it. I didn't get the link before we met, so I'm sorry about that. But it's 3 songs per chapter, starting with the community chapter. So the first 3 songs belong to the community chapter. The next 3 songs are step 1. The next 3 songs are step 2. And it goes like that until we get to step 10. And the idea here is to feel first, always feel first. And then second, you can analyze the lyrics and you can analyze what we're trying to put together here. But we see a playlist as a story, as a movement, as a flow from one space to another.
I just think that's so cool. What a very creative way to embody basically what we are trying to share, and another way of deep reconnection. So please tell Amy I'm just thrilled with it. So before we kind of open it up, I just wanted to know if you could share a couple of success stories from people who have created the program. How has it changed people?
Thank you for this question. And I am, I'll be honest that sometimes I'm a little frustrated by this question, because I think that it fits in line with the productivity. Like, we have to be able to see that there's an end result for something to matter. And I still think it's an important question, because what has happened is difficult for me to articulate, other than it is subtle and it is inviting more openness, and it helps us reorient the way that we are with each other and the questions we're really willing to ask. And so a lot of what I see happening is, one, the deep desire and yearning for more connection spaces, and realizing what we've been lacking this whole time. Like, oh, we can do this, we can meet like this, we can talk about these things we're not allowed to talk about anywhere else. But there's also the unlearning and realizing how limited our perspectives are. Like, what questions have we not been asking? What questions have we not even thought about asking about the ways that we're being with each other and the way that this culture works? And then in addition to that, I think to deal with this predicament, we have to deal with it at a subtle level. I think a lot about my own trauma healing, and I'm always waiting for something really big and really grandiose to happen. Like, oh, trauma's fixed, it's healed, like, don't have to deal with that again. And I think that the trauma healing of the planet is the same, and the trauma healing of our culture is the same. It's at the subtle level, and it's at the level of our personal values, our collective values, our worldviews, but it's also in the way that we practice and engage on the day-to-day. And I think that the 10-step program helps us be different so that our actions can be different. It removes the frenzy, the despair, the grief, the fear, so that we can actually tap into that connection, that authenticity, that vulnerability that helps us shape into something else. You know, there are big and grandiose things that we've done, and I think they're big. Maybe other people don't, but like, we think meaningful action is a reinvestment in parenting. So you're not projecting your fears onto your kid. You know, you're helping your kid be more resilient. We think meaningful action is gardening and sharing your extra produce with your neighbor, or just going to meet your neighbors. You know, we think these actions are also then becoming space holders for your community, being able to be that stable person who can hear other people's despair and other people's losses without being overly reactive. And then, of course, we have people who go on to do far greater engagement and direct action. We have people who have been previously burnt out, able to then reinsert themselves into the things that are really meaningful for them. But for me, what I'm most captivated by is this slow, subtle difference of the way that we're being. It's like a ripple revolution where we change from the inside out, and then we become transformed at the potential that we see within a 10-step program. Like, we can be different, and we just get to glimpse it for 10 weeks, you know?
Well, thanks for that, Laura. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we open it up to the big group?
I have two things. May I do two things?
Certainly.
Okay. The first thing is that I always want to end on a invitation for courage, and I have the sign behind me that says "Be brave," because I think courage and bravery are absolutely what's needed right now. And I think it's important to name and to note that we can have these conversations about all of these existential things, and we can connect on them, but they're super abstract, and we can fool ourselves into thinking that we're doing something big by having these conversations. But I want to invite us back into the feeling part of it, which often is gritty and gross and hard. Like, there are people dying right now in the world, and we can talk about it, but to feel it and to pause it is totally different and requires courage. Embodiment can be really difficult, especially because we spend a lot of our time intellectualizing our way out of it. I do this all the time. I'm a very logical person, and yet I have to find space for me to not run away, not push it down, not hide from it, and actually face my grief and face my fear, which is totally different than talking about it. And so if we can learn how to embrace the pain alongside the beauty, if we can feel the terror and know it's not permanent and that it'll move, and that there actually, at the same time terror exists, there is a generative nature to life and to growth and to healing. And so one of the things I want to end on is this invitation of both and. Like, let's be careful not to over intellectualize the path forward and to feel it, like to get back into connection and to feel it. And then also to practice courage in doing so, because embodiment is hard, being alive is hard, feeling is hard. and it's worth it. I'm learning it's worth it. It's like an everyday process for me as somebody who lives with a lot of trauma. Like it's painful and it's hard and it's worth it. And then the other thing, if I may, is a poem. Okay. This poem is by Aisha Siddiqa, and she is a young poet and just very brilliant. And we end all of our gatherings in Good Grief Network on a poem because it gets us into that liminal space, that space between worlds, the space between words, the space where imagination is and where feeling is. So I'll end with a poem called On Another Panel About Climate. They asked me to sell the future, and all I've got is a love poem. What if the future is soft and revolution is so kind that there is no end to us in sight? Whole cities breathe and bad luck is bested by a promise to the leaves. To withstand your own end is difficult. The future frolics about, promise to no one, as is her right. Rage against injustice makes the voice grow harsher yet. If the future leaves without us, the silence that will follow will be an unspeakable nothing. What if we convince her to stay? How rare and beautiful it is that we exist. What if we stun existence one more time? When I wake up, get out of bed, my 7-year-old cousin with her ruptured belly tags along. Then follows my grandmother, aunts, and my other cousins in the violent shape of their drinking water. The earth remembers everything. Our bodies are the color of earth, and we are nobodies. Been born from so many apocalypses, what's one more? Love is still the only revenge. It grows each time the earth is set on fire. But for what it's worth, I'd do this again. Gamble on humanity 100 times over. Commit to life unto life as the trees fall and take them with us. I'd follow love into extinction.
Thank you. Beautiful.
Thank you.
Okay, on that very poignant note, I'm going to remove our spotlights and we will go into group conversation. Monica?
If people have questions that they want to ask or comments they'd like to make, and you don't want to be recorded, feel free to pop that in the chat and I'll read it out. If you're ready to raise your hand and ask a question like Christine is, that's fine too. And like Carol said, we'll have time at the end for people who don't want to be on camera. So Christine, what's your question or comment?
Thank you. I have to hop off in just a few minutes, so I was hoping to get my question in. LaUra, thank you for this. I've been aware of your organization for a little bit, but have been waiting to hear about it more directly. So this was amazing. While you were speaking, I was on your website just looking to see if you're doing any facilitation training, and I see that it's like closed. I'm not sure when you might open that back up again, so I'm curious about that.
Thank you, Christine. Our goal is January or February of 2024, and it will be a 12-week training. And we'll have more details out in the coming month or so. And I believe there's a sign up on the website where you can stay engaged with our announcements. And if not, you can email me directly and I'll make sure that you know. I'll put my email in the chat.
Thank you. Thank you. This was lovely. I appreciate everyone who worked on this to get you here to talk to us today. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And they'll be sending a little follow-up email around with LaUra's email address and links and stuff like that too for people.
Real, you had your hand up?
Yeah, I love the presentation. Thank you very much. I'm just wondering from terror management theory, I can't articulate it that well, but the belief is that our culture buffers us from our death anxiety, and spirituality and religion more specifically is a big part of our culture. So I had asked the minister of our church, like, do you think that spirituality and religion helps us deal with our death anxiety? She says, of course, that's the reason we have it. So I spent a number of years asking friends about this subject matter, and they I would say that almost everybody has some sort of spiritual belief that I don't know if it's the denial of being an animal, or if it's just, or if the thought of something existing beyond our mortal being helps. But if it's a denial, then how do you get past that second or third stage that you've mentioned?
I'm not sure that I understand the question entirely. Like how spirituality is a denial of our
Or
mortality?
is it? Because in terror management theory, spiritual belief is considered a way of buffering us from mortality salient.
There are many different types of spirituality, and I suppose that it comes down to what are your beliefs and how are you using it. And spiritual bypass comes up quite a bit. Like, are we engaging in spirituality so we don't have to be here and we're looking forward to the after, we're just rushing ourselves to the afterlife? Or does our spirituality presence us more in the here and now because we're intimately connected with everything that is? And so of course we want to minimize harm. I think like everything, it's how we use the tool. I think spirituality can be a gift. I think we need a spiritual revolution here and now, but what does that mean? That'd be a whole nother talk. But I think we need to get down to what helps us remember that we are human animals and that we're a part of this earth, and how does that help us connect more? Because I think my definition of spirituality is just really enhanced connection. Like, spirituality is me being connected to everything that is, and knowing that I'm just going to play my little part, and then at the end of my life, like, okay, that's done. My cells are going to disintegrate and get repurposed into something else.
Yeah.
But again, if you're using your spirituality to be like, I don't care about the earth, I'm going someplace else, then that has a lot of implications for harm here in the present.
No, I see it the same way as you. It's just most people seem to be more at ease with death anxiety because they do feel that there's a component that exists that is beyond being an animal. It's just, I've been at this for 13 years, and there's nobody that I have never met anybody who kind of agrees that we're just a mortal animal. I have to say, on CBC, our national TV, David Suzuki, they asked him after all these years, and as a like an eco activist, what's your best bit of advice? And he said to never forget that you are animal, I'm animal, we are animal. I mean, it was so brilliant, but I don't know, nobody is willing to talk about that, and I'd love to join your network to have those kind of discussions.
Yeah, well, you are welcome. My email's in the chat. You can send me an email. And we just got funding to create a membership network. And so we're going to call it the Community Practice Hub. And we're going to be able to explore all types of these questions above and beyond the 10 steps. Because obviously the 10 steps is not inclusive of the many, many, many questions that exist in the world. And I'd love for that to be a subject, both death anxiety and coming back to our animal nature. And what does that mean?
Yeah, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Others? Questions, comments? Oh, Linda, go ahead.
It was the phrase, the long dark really hit me, because I was in a simplicity circle for 10 years, starting in the late 90s. And we were reading James Howard Kunstler, who talked about the long emergency. And I just thought about how those two concepts are so different. The long emergency immediately, at least for me, makes me nervous. It's like, oh my God, how am I going to deal with this? Endless emergency. And this was before a lot of the thinking like you are putting forward, where we've got to learn to be more skillful dealing with this on an emotional level and even a spiritual level, than just be in one long panic over this predicament. And I just wanted to thank you and Amy for doing this. It's just really powerful medicine. And it's desperately needed right now.
Yeah, thank you, Linda. We like to say we stand on the shoulders of giants because there are so many great thinkers and teachers, and we've had the privilege and honor of learning from so many and just kind of funneling it through our life experience. And so we definitely send the gratitude back out into the world for letting us be students forever.
There is a question.
Oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Linda.
I just didn't want to take two questions if somebody else had a question.
We've got a bit of time, so I think you can finish and then we'll get.
Okay, great. I was going to ask about the 12 steps. I've been in a 12-step movement forever, and it's so powerful, that whole idea of the fellowship and supporting people through these different changes. And I'm just curious how that fit into developing this, or what your inspiration was.
Yeah, I'm a grateful member of Adult Children of Alcoholics and found a lot of healing in those rooms. And obviously they engage with a totally different subject matter, and yet they teach us really well the power of collective spaces and what kind of healing can be there. They also teach us really well the importance of bearing witness and having your story shared. I think that they have provided a really great model for healing, and like all models, no one model works for everyone. So we need a variety of models. But what I noticed about my entrance into a 12-step modality is that we didn't have to argue why we were in the room. We didn't have to argue about a lot of things. It was like, if you step into that room, we all know why you're there, and we can start at this other baseline. Like, we can start a conversation that's different from the outside world that maybe doesn't understand why we're in the room to begin with. And I found a lot of freedom in that, like just being able to show up and knowing that I live with some amount of dysfunction, and just being able to own that in a circle with other people who live with a lot of dysfunction. There's something really liberating about going into an intentional space where you know you're going to be working through something, and that you know that other people aren't going to directly comment on what you say, and instead they're going to come with gratitude and just see you as a human being that's trying to do your best in this time and place. And so the 12-step modalities have been really informative to how the 10 steps have been formed. I was actively going to meetings every week and thinking, we need this for climate. Like, we need this for the existential pain that we're feeling, and how do we repurpose a program for a totally different way of being and way of healing.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So there's a question from Elisa. I am wondering if the 10 steps might look different when working with youth.
Yeah, that's a great question too. We actually have a program for youth. It is more experiential, and it is 5 weeks instead of 10. And our 10-step program is for 2 hours each. And the youth program, which we call GGNZ, is an hour and a half. And this program focuses a lot on helping youth find their tools. Specifically, it's a teen program. So the demographic that we're looking for, the age range that we're looking for, is 14 to 18. But we know young folks are suffering. We know that emotional intelligence isn't really easily taught, particularly in schools. And so our program, the 5-week program, is really trying to teach them what are resources, where do you go to when you're feeling a level of distress that you might not otherwise know how to do, what are mindfulness practices. We do some hands-on teaching of practices so they can incorporate that back into their everyday lives. And so it's quite different than the 10-step program, just because at that level of development, it might not be. We have had young folks come through. We had a 13-year-old and his mother come through when we first started, and I think it was really helpful and healing for him. He cried through the first 3 sessions, and then afterwards was able to like come back into the circle and feel a little bit more. But we have to be developing programs for kids, or some sort of help for these young folks, because they're just growing up in a world that they already can identify is deeply flawed. And the young folks seem to be getting the intersectionality of these issues way better than us older folks. And so a target to the youth to help them, I think, is essential. And our GGNZ program, thanks Kay, GGNZ is a phenomenal name. Our GGNZ program is funded and it starts in November. And so if anybody knows a teen who is suffering, somebody between 14 and 18 who's suffering with existential despair and wants a safe place to connect, you can email me and I'll get you signed up for it. But it'll be $10 for the workbook. But other than that, the program is funded by one of our sponsors.
Is it online?
It will be online. Yep. It'll be through Zoom.
Thanks for that, LaUra. Carol?
So, LaUra, I've attended many experiential intensives, and then it's like, oh my goodness, that was so great. I was heard, I was listened to, and then I go back to Silly Bugger Society, and it's like there's no community of support. How and to me, it's kind of like it's traumatic to go from being intensely heard and supported to being disconnected again. So how do you help people bridge that?
Yeah, wonderful question. And it has pulled at my heartstrings for all 7 years of Good Grief Network's existence. Because we've noticed this pattern as well. Like, first of all, people are like 10 weeks, that's so much. And then at week 6 or 7 or 8, they start getting sad because they're like, oh, this is going to end soon. What happens after this? And we're realizing that we've been joking for a long time about what step 11 is. Like, what happens after step 10? How do we integrate this? Because you're right, we get pulled right back into business as usual. We get pulled back into our day-to-day lives, and we need something to sustain ourselves. And so our solution, which I named a moment ago, is to create we're going to call it a community practice hub. And it's the idea that we can have drop-in steps, we can have drop-in discussions, we can have drop-in sharing sessions, but we need sparks in our community above and beyond Good Grief Network that remind us of this interconnection, remind us of this vulnerability. And if we don't have it, if we don't have it accessible, then that probably means we have to be the ones to create it and find other people who want to be relating in those ways on the ground in our local communities. And that's harder said than done, of course, especially in COVID times and all those things. But we absolutely need to find ways to build those into our daily lives. And for some of us, that has to be through the digital world. You know, some of us don't live in places where we can have pockets of support locally. So praise Zeus for the digital realm.
Yeah. One quick thing that I was encouraged when I brought up this issue over decades of work was trying to identify someone who at least is a good listener prior to going into the program. So you almost have somebody to be there, walk with you, or at least come back to, as opposed to starting from scratch kind of thing. And I found that kind of approach worked for me. But anyways. Yeah.
It's brilliant. It's brilliant because one of the therapists we're working with, she calls something like that coping ahead. Like, what are you going to need ahead of this, and have some foresight to be able to plan that. I think that's a brilliant invitation, Carol.
Okay, good. Go ahead, use it, and then tell us about it the next visit.
Okay, in 4 years.
Yeah, there you go. So we're coming down to the end of our hour here. Is there any other last questions? Burning things we want to ask LaUra? I'm so grateful for you because I know you're blasting 1,000 miles an hour. And LaUra, do you have any last words of wisdom for us to close off?
Just gratitude for all the folks who are willing to enter into this space. You know, talking about our feelings tends to be really taboo in the culture at large. And so I think anybody who shows up to a talk of this type is yearning for that thing. And we have that spark of inspiration or that spark of motivation to figure out how to live more authentically and more connected. And so praise to the folks who take time out of their day and their attention to come here and to share these thoughts and ideas and to listen. You know, like, I am just an everyday person who is really interested in resilience because of my own life history and because of my own traumas. And so I think each of us is being called to be a change maker in our own way. And Obviously, they don't have to all look the same, but the fact that, again, these people are here, y'all are here, and you want to be engaging in this way is really meaningful because it's the work that needs to be done in this time. So thank you for showing up.
Super. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Have a wonderful week, wonderful month. I'm not sure what's happening next month. Stay tuned, but watch for an email coming out with links and stuff. Okay. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, folks.
Take care.
Laura.
Thank you, Carol and Linda and Monica.